What is really incredible about the state of Georgia is how diverse it is from each end to the other. We just have all these beautiful natural resources, and that's what makes it really beautiful.
You start at the mountains and the Appalachians, you come down through central Georgia, the coastal plains, and then the coast. You see a state of incredible diversity.
Diverse in every way, diverse obviously in population, growing in our diversity more so than almost any other state in recent decades.
2/3 of the land mass and 1/3 of the people live south of the fault line, and 2/3 of the people and 1/3 of the land mass exist north of the fault line.
We have a beautiful coastline, we have mountains, we have agricultural plains and areas, we have cities and urban areas, we have very remote rural areas. If you want it, you can find it in Georgia.
Georgia has one of the great reputations of the great state to do business, but much of that today is couched in our urban areas and in the hub cities of 65,000 and more.
You have many, many businesses beginning to come to Metro Atlanta. They see, of course, the advantage of having a business near a thriving academic environment as well as a strong logistical environment. We have a Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. So our economy is growing as a result of many businesses that are beginning to move here.
And that there's a great difference between what's happening there in the old historical counties of Georgia, the rural counties that have played such a great role in this state's history.
We have to make sure that Georgia succeeds, because if Georgia doesn't succeed, then Metro Atlanta falters. And by and change, the other side of the coin is if Metro Atlanta doesn't succeed, then Georgia falters.
We have a real battle happening now on the state level between not just two Georgias, but an old Georgia versus a new Georgia. We are becoming more and more diverse. Our economy, of course, is becoming more diverse. We're moving not just away from a more localized economy, but towards a global economy.
The biggest difference in Atlanta over the years I see is the people that move into Atlanta from other parts of the country. So they don't always have, a clear understanding of Georgia and what's in Georgia.
You have on one hand, perhaps a region of transplants that don't have kind of a long history of understanding how Georgia grew. And then you have rural Georgia who has generations of individuals who are proud to be a Georgian, perhaps not understanding what it's like to live in Atlanta and what the challenges and opportunities are there.
And it's really difficult for people who live in urban areas to understand kind of what we deal with on a rural basis and vice versa.
It's alarming to me to find out that so many people that live in the metropolitan areas really have no idea where their food comes from. The vitality of the state of Georgia and the nation depends on its farming communities. We need resources. We need to grow. We need more industry. We need more commercial business. We need reasons for people to want to come here and stay.
The growth of Metro Atlanta and other urban populations in Georgia should not correspond with the evacuation of rural Georgia.
I really believe we're moving down this road of a clash of ideology, and we have to try to find a way to figure that out soon, or we're all going to pay the price.
This map is from 1833.
If we are courageous enough to have a serious conversation and work together around, minimizing the challenges that we face in this region, in this city, in this state, we're going to have to understand where those divides began.
The two Georgia concept really came about back in the 80s. It was a period of time when we sat down and talked about this changing environment that we all saw and knew was coming. That report shed light on it, and it brought to the forefront the term two Georgias. There were those at the time in higher government that did not like the report. It was trash canned basically, never acted upon.
Of course, Georgia has such a long history of that kind of divide, going back to the days when our legislature used to be apportioned illegally, as the United States Supreme Court ultimately decided, misproportioned in a way that gave too much favoritism to rural areas. But after the Supreme Court struck down the way we reapportioned our legislature and gave credence to the one man, one vote principle, and more equity came about in our legislature, I think that saw some balance. But from that point forward, the emphasis on rural Georgia began to shrink, and still shrinks every time we have a 10-year reapportionment of our policy-making bodies in the legislature, because the growth is not happening in rural Georgia.
What I see, unfortunately, is somewhat of a schism in the state today, of a steadily departing, going in different direction, urban versus rural.
Rural Georgia has gotten somewhat of a chip on its shoulder, I think, because they don't have the clout they used to have in public policy. That leads to inequities that flow into our school systems, and the workforce that comes out of our school systems, that flow into our health care systems, that flows into the overall health of communities, which is very unfortunate for the overall health of the state.
Everything that we saw happening has just gone forward just as we predicted. And when you begin to look, you cannot draw a pretty picture about the state's future if the current trend in this schism of urban versus rural continues. The old economy of the rural part of our state and rural communities is a model that has totally gone with the wind. And that model was one where the money turned over in the community. The people who owned the stores, who carried on the commerce, they lived there, raised their families there. The money left the land and returned into the little town where it turned over and generated the things that you need to sustain small communities. All you got to do is go and look and see. And ride through one of those small towns and see how many stores are closed. You begin to get a picture of what's happening.
The population is being affected emotionally and even physically by this exodus into the city, exodus to a bigger town.
And you see the things that come with low socioeconomic and sinking conditions. Obesity, addictions, tobacco use, despondency. It's all there. When the economy goes into the tank, everything follows it into the tank.
Farms in Georgia have continued to kind of go into the large-scale farming. You know, you think about peaches being popular in Georgia. Well, there's only like about 6 or 7 major peach farmers in Georgia. There are some small ones, but it's these large farms that really drive the agricultural economy.
When you see one of these big farming operations with a lot of big equipment, that farm operation is farming what 75 to 100 farmers used to farm. Those families, they're no longer out there living and working on the land.
The small farm where I was born and where I grew up is no longer existent.
So we've got to address the whole economic picture.
And in the modern day society and economy, the action follows the money.
When you're looking at the two Georgias, if you look at Metro Atlanta, much more technology driven, much more service driven, much more headquarters, those types of things, which demand a different type of workforce.
We're going to wind up, when you look at the population projections, the opportunities, the job creation, it's all on one end of the state.
Unfortunately, though, that economic interest is not necessarily translating into economic opportunity for many of the current residents that reside in Metro Atlanta. More people who are moving to our region are benefiting from it versus the people that are already here. In Atlanta alone, for the third year in a row, we're #1 for income inequality. Many of the challenges that we see not too far from here in Vine City and English Avenue are the same challenges that people and children are experiencing in Clay County.
When you begin to get the economy vibrant, people begin to expand, you have money to invest. You look at life with a totally different outlook.
How are we going to find a way to ensure that all people are educated and have the ability to roll up their sleeves and strengthen our economy?
We're trying to save every small community, and that's difficult when every small community doesn't have access to good health care, good education, good workforce.
And when you see what's happened to the workforce and the productivity of our population in the rural areas because of this miasma that we're under from these social economic conditions, you cannot say we've got a great productive workforce.
I think that workforce has become such an important issue. Then when the recession came, so many people left where they were to go find jobs in the metropolitan Atlanta area and are kind of staying.
So there's a difference between a job and a career trajectory. And I think if we can focus on the career trajectory in the small towns, then what they have is a career span as opposed to a job.
Not everybody needs a bachelor's degree to do what they want to do in life. So we're trying to make it possible. The technical college system of Georgia and the university system as well, we want you to have a good education. We want you to be able to stay in your home. If you want to live on a farm, you want to live on that farm forevermore, we want to make it possible.
It's hard to talk about what's happening in higher education without talking about the K through 12 experience because they're so interrelated. Number one is the funding and the funding disparities because our school systems are largely funded by a local government's tax base, and that's where we have such wide disparities.
Especially in some of these rural communities, we are not stretching our dollar effectively because we're trying to set up 2 or 3 education systems and support them when there may need to be only one.
When you have a county that doesn't have a constant inflow of new people and new ideas, and a school system it becomes so insular, then your local control means we don't even know really how we ought to be preparing our children to compete in a truly global world. So by virtue of birth, these kids have inequities that they face for the rest of their life.
Without a solid education system, there are students that won't have those opportunities to move on and break out of that poverty cycle that we do see down here. Poverty is such a huge problem across Southwest Georgia.
I think of all the people that I went to high school with and who've become successful people, but most of them didn't become successful people down here.
The brain drain is one of the great fallouts that has occurred in our rural communities across the state. When our young leadership, our thinkers, our leaders have no choice but to go where the opportunities are, it's evidenced everywhere.
So we really need to figure out a way to attract people back into rural Georgia and to keep our communities alive.
We need better internet. We need faster internet. We need more communications, period.
I think the expansion of broadband is a great place to be thinking about what businesses could operate anywhere with better broadband service.
There are people who I think would come back here, would move to this area if there were a few more opportunities.
Technology makes the location of jobs there, much more viable than anything we've seen 20 years ago, 50 years ago.
You had reliable internet services. It opens up the opportunity and availability for some of the young people to be able to go back.
We've got to make sure that we direct and incentivize businesses to locate and expand into those areas, because that will drive people who want to be there. But the business opportunities have to be there first before the people come.
Healthcare is another great equalizer along with education and workforce. How do you attract a doctor to a region that doesn't have a hospital? How do you attract a manufacturing facility to a community that doesn't have quality healthcare? And we have those challenges, by the way, in Metro Atlanta with healthcare.
You have one challenge in urban areas where children may not necessarily have access to Medicare or Medicaid or CHIP to actually have access to healthcare. In rural Georgia, the hospitals are closing, which means that the kids in that community don't have access to healthcare either.
I don't see how you could ignore the healthcare problems in rural areas. You know, it's strange to me that you let rural areas suffer because of lack of medical services when you could have put more money into it.
There's already a shortage of physicians and nurses across the United States. Georgia is one of those that's particularly challenged. But when you look at the state of Georgia, it's not equally distributed. There are many more physicians and workforce, healthcare workforce in Atlanta, but so much less in Central and South Georgia.
So we need to look at them geographically and say there's a need for the basic services here as much as we can provide, and we're not going to let that go. That has to be a commitment.
The hospital itself and the health system itself, what can it do to begin to deliver care that's cheaper but a lot more accessible, that could go out in a great outreach program to those vulnerable communities as opposed to waiting for them to be so very sick, at which point the cost of healthcare is going to be so much higher.
And you poll Georgians right now, almost 67% of Georgians want some form of Medicaid expansion. But yet we have for 8-10 years now decided to not expand Medicaid. And that has had devastating consequences on rural hospitals.
We're not a state where Medicaid expansion was approved. So there may be another way for us to come up with a similar program, not necessarily the federally mandated program, that allows us to provide the same elements and the same benefits to the community out there.
The biggest environmental issue that this state is faced with is water, clean water. And how we use it determines whether we're going to be able to provide it for the future.
Water, I believe, is a challenge for the ag community at the moment, more so than it is urban areas, residential areas. So there's got to be a way for us as a state to not see one as having and one as not having, or limiting one or the other. And that's the trap that we've been caught in.
There's a mindset that I've observed in metro areas that farmers don't need water, that they waste water, and that all that matters is more water for more growth and development in Atlanta. And so throughout this period of decades that we've been in this Georgia, Florida, Alabama water war, Southwest Georgia's interests have certainly aligned more with Florida because it's been sort of the anti-Atlanta.
We absolutely depend on water for our livelihoods in South Georgia. I hear from our leaders and I hear from the media how great of a job Atlanta is doing, and they should be praised. Atlanta has done a phenomenal job with water conservation, but my personal goal has been to add to that story and to add agriculture's story to that as well.
You know, the first environmentalists anywhere in the country are the farmers, because I mean it's their vested interest to be good environmentalists because that's where they're making their living. And so there's a misconception that farmers are not good environmentalists, but they are.
You will never, ever find anybody more interested in the good of the land or anybody that loves the land any more than a farmer. They don't own the land owns them.
So we've got to make sure Atlanta and Southwest Georgia have the water they need.
Can we bridge a gap of more understanding of what you need, how you really do use it, and how can we all be better stewards of resources like that?
We all can agree with the fact that conservation and stewardship of our natural resources is critical going forward, and the more we can adapt to these various natural resource challenges that we're having, the better equipped we'll be in the future.
Whether you are in the rural communities, urban communities, or suburban communities, we have a shared destiny as a state, and we all can play a part in moving our communities forward if we understand that we're all connected as a community.
The more we can help bridge that gap of understanding, the more we can provide education, I think the better off we all are, and the more we can tap into good ideas and best practices from around the world, the better off we will be.
Yes, there's two Georgias. There's the city, that part up there, and then there's this part down here, the rural part, and I will tell you there's room for both.
When people say, well, what can rural Georgia do for Metro Atlanta, or what can Metro Atlanta do for rural Georgia? Why can't we do it together for Georgia?
If we can begin to move forward and encourage people to focus on our shared values, then I think that could potentially provide a point of entry for us to begin to undo some of the historical challenges that we faced as it relates to the urban, suburban, and rural divide.
Truly, it takes all of us. It takes the whole state of Georgia to make Georgia as wonderful as it is. And we really need to be focusing on working together.
You're in this state, and either there's going to be a cost to the rest of the state out here in the rural communities, it's going to be a socioeconomic drag, higher medical cost to the state, all of those things that come, less productivity, or it can be an asset to our state. Now those are the choices we have to make.
The more we perpetuate the reality that there are two Georgias, then we continue to not make progress.
It's going to take some leadership, people recognizing that all of Georgia can flourish, that if we all grow and we all prosper, in some way, the entire state benefits.
But we need the good thinkers and the people who have the influence and who are articulate and who can frame this thing up so that we truly know what is happening in Georgia and whether or not we see that direction being the right direction, and if not, what can we do to help with the situation?
We're at a point in Georgia where I think we need more risk takers who are willing to step up and say, this has to happen and I'm going to be committed to make it happen, and I'm going to assemble a willing group of like minds who we can educate and help them understand this needs to happen for the good of this state.
I think what is needed is a broader effort that encompasses our great foundations in this state, our universities, our legislature and state leaders, of course, leaders who understand the connectivity of this big state's interest and understand that we're driving a state, not a city, not a rural countryside, a state that encompasses all of that. So that everyone doesn't have to go to one place to live and to find the new modern opportunities.
Whether it's health care or whether it's broadband, whether it's education, it can't be just Southwest Georgia. You have to have that support of Atlanta and the state working on what those solutions are to move some of the things outside of a 1-hour radius of the Atlanta airport.
The people in the rural communities love what they do. They love the land, they love their communities, they love the pace in which we live. And so I think the struggle is going to be able to develop the process as we move forward to realize that there can be growth without compromising the standard of living that we've come to love here in the rural communities.
We have examples of success stories, and I think it would be good to exchange those ideas and see what those communities are doing and bring it back to other small towns. And we need to evolve the way the rest of the state is evolving too.
But looking to the future and determining what do we want to look like 10 years from now, and then driving our process to get there.
But we have to get both sides, wear that other person's shoes basically, and walk for a day or two in their shoes and see what it's like.
I've never seen anything that works any better than one-on-one conversation with somebody if you're trying to get your point across.
To Cochran's Creek and Cochran's into Amicalola. Okay.
IGEL can be a place and a process by which the right information gets out to people in ways that participants can become the messengers of better information that helps to bridge the distrust, mistrust, between different parts of Georgia.
In marine systems, like in the Rocky Intertidal?
If anything, we can be a voice for unifying versus, trying to bifurcate. And the more that we can have people that speak from that hymnal, the better our opportunity is going to be.
It's going to be important for IGELians to take on a courageous posture as it relates to bringing the two Georgias together. It is going to take courage and a willingness to reach towards segments of the community, perspectives that we may not necessarily reach towards in our regular life.
Wake up, folks. This is something good. You need to be involved in it. It's going to affect generations of Georgians to come, and there's time to turn the tide.